Welcome to your 11th podcast, not for a quiz, but for general information concerning the guidelines for literary composition and what I'll be expecting for your written work. We'll start with ways to begin. We move to incorporating literary terms, ways to conclude, and pet peeves. So, some ways to begin. You can start your writing with regard to the author of the time period, and especially if we're talking about Shakespeare, this is important because it is fixing our attention in a prior period. You can start by talking about the analysis itself. For example, here, metaphor is far more common than metonymy, yet the latter may have a greater impact on the reader, especially in poetry. So in this one, I'm really going to be discussing metaphor and metonymy. And not that Shakespeare's secondary, but I'm using him to discuss these. You can also talk with regard to a genre if someone stretches the confines of a genre, for example. Here's one on Kurt Vonnegut. Some readers see science fiction as the greatest of all creative endeavors, mixing contemporary social commentary and imaginative creations of what could be. I'm using singles here because I use doubles here. Kurt Vonnegut's work fits this description well. All right, so I start with the genre to lead into this person's work and how he is, for example, the epitome of this type of best science fiction possible. Let's read Homer's Odyssey too. Homer's Odyssey, though it takes on larger, more epic proportions, can be read as one man's struggle to find himself. So epic, that's what we call it, it's epic poetry, and yet what is interesting or unusual is that we return to one man, whereas the Iliad was really about many, many men, although it ends with Hector's death. Starting with regard to the text, for example, let's look at this one. If Tolstoy's Master and Man, it's a short story, was written by a complex and often contradictory author, it makes use, nevertheless, of uncomplicated plot development and unambiguous character portrayal. So a little bit of a balance there between what we expect and what we receive. Here's another one. Tobias Wolff's short story, The Rich Brother, short story, singles around that because we're in doubles, interestingly creates a question with its title. Which of the brothers is rich, and in what way? So regard to the text or the content itself. When I'm writing, how can I incorporate literary terms into my sentences? Let's choose a short one. Jack London employs metaphor throughout to build a fire in a way that personifies the landscape, such as this dark hairline was the trail, or a skin of ice half an inch thick. These are on the outside because I'm pulling in, but normally remember the page number is not included within those. It's just because I'm pulling these out of a paper, so to speak. But what you should notice is that I've incorporated the literary term of metaphor, and I've given it in a way so that you know how to read the examples that follow. Here's another one. Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich begins with a seemingly simple narration, though most of the story concerns the analepsis which follows. Analepsis is simply a jump into the past, so you think of flashback, but if you're speaking in terms of narratology, you should talk about prolepsis going forward and analepsis going back. So now I'm talking about the narration of the story, which is the flashback. The story is the flashback, but it begins at the present, at his death. Okay, so some examples of ways you can elegantly incorporate complicated terms, but giving the examples of the term and signaling to the reader how she or he should read that term in the example. Concluding, people always think this is the hardest part, but I think it's always the most optimistic. Let's try one on Shakespeare here. As we have seen, Shakespeare's use of Anthemiria and Hendiadys and Julius Caesar clearly or unmistakably reveals a desire on the part of the playwright to create strong mental pictures in the spectator. All right, so I'm concluding. I take my term of Anthemia and Hendiadys, and I tell why Shakespeare has used this. I remind them of what I've said earlier in that paragraph. Beaumarchais' portrait of Lucille, as seen through this study, furnishes something else. Or from the elements discussed above, the Odyssey can either be classified as, etc. So, pulling in and reformulating my sentences, thinking of which words should be first, and how I can lead elegantly into perhaps a new idea. For example, the aim of this study or exploration analysis has been to, yet the question of XYZ may remain. And that's always a good thing. It means you're still thinking. What you must avoid. Please take note. I hate to see these things. Okay, first off, let's say this is Margaret Atwood. I don't know her personally, so I wouldn't call her Margaret, and neither should you. Also, Margaret Atwood is not trying to show that. Margaret Atwood shows that. So in this passage, Atwood shows that, or highlights that, or points out that. She's not trying to do something. She's a pro. She's doing it. Okay? Or this was Margaret Cavendish. In this passage, Cavendish reveals or shows that. Please take this word out of your vocabulary. It's vapid, vacuous, and takes your grade down the vacuum cleaner. So Hemingway truly uses descriptions well. I hate truly. Hemingway's use of description serves the role of. Isn't that much better? Also, don't be categorical. Never or using not shows that you've only read a part of the play. Brutus doesn't make any good decisions. No. Brutus's decision-making powers are called into question by the playwright, who shows that even a seemingly sound decision may have far-reaching negative consequences. Clearly, means and aims must be consistent. A much stronger idea than this. Another one. This passage just adds the idea of meaninglessness to the entire context of war. Oh, why should we talk about it then? Take out just. This passage unequivocally adds a dimension of meaningless to blah, blah, blah. Wrong. Beowulf always, again categorical. Beowulf always seems to act in a self-effacing way. No, Beowulf's modesty, as seen in example 1, example 2, and example 3, builds the image of the type of humble warrior that his men admire. A much larger, richer, a more carefully composed idea than simply, he's always just modest. He's a modest kind of guy. So when you're rereading, things that you want to look for to make sure you've not made a mistake of a grammatical order, because remember, those are the ones that detract from the content and make your teacher think, oh, that student's not capable of thinking along those lines because that student doesn't know how to mark possessives. Remember? James's book, apostrophe S, or Dickens' book, but it's the Sherman's dog, right? Apostrophe S, even if it's ending in S, if it's a singular noun, and if it's a plural, it's just S apostrophe. And sometimes students forget to mark them, or they'll just have a plural noun and they decide that the Sherman's needs to have an apostrophe when there doesn't need to be one because it's not showing possession. Possessives are showing possession. Clarity. Get rid of the little words. Get rid of those words that accumulate within sentences. Try to reorganize your words so that the right words stand out and you can get rid of the clutter. Proper referencing. This is so important and so often forgotten, but you must reference all of the lines that you borrow from a text. I need page numbers if we're talking about, for example, a novel, and line numbers, scene numbers, if I'm talking about drama. And all of the works, need to be in that documentation section, every one of them. Please don't get yourselves in trouble. This is the thing that gets you thrown out from the academy quicker than anything else. And colloquial English, please don't use it. Make it academic. Achilles hung out too much with Patroclus. Maybe not, but I've seen it in papers. Achilles and Patroclus' friendship. Here I'm not doing it, and I'll explain why in just a minute. plays a determining role in the climax of the Iliad. There's only one possessive marker here, Achilles and Patroclus, because it's something they share. And here we have a Greek name, and with Greek names, very often the rule has been not to add the S at the end. This is changing, and you need to be aware that people are not sure how to mark these anymore. MLA tells you one thing, but it doesn't give a full picture. Brutus's and Cassius's reasons for killing Caesar are vastly different. See, you would have separate possession for this reason. So single thing, their friendship, but different reasons for killing Caesar. So reread carefully, make sure that your sentences flow one into the next, and I've heard people say that the best way to do that is to read your papers backwards to see if your logic stands up, if you can take away ideas that way and still keep the logic. Also avoid, again, the clutter of writing late at night and not going back and taking time to refine your sentences into something meaningful. And don't say truly. Please, don't say truly. And that concludes our podcast on the general guidelines for literary composition.